part 2 of lesson 6 of chapter 4, more on inverse trig functions. So in this problem, you see it says find the exact value of each expression if it exists. Well, here we got the sine of a sine inverse of negative 1/4. Well, essentially what's happening in this problem is the sine and the sine inverse just cancel each other off, and our answer is just negative 1/4. Makes sense that a sine would cancel off a sine inverse. However, that's not always the case. If you look at this problem, same directions, find the exact value of each expression. It says arctangent, which just means tangent inverse of tangent. In this case, they don't cancel each other because when it says arctangent of tangent of pi over 2, well, tangent of pi over 2 is undefined. And so if you do arctangent of an undefined value, there's two places on the unit circle where the tangent equals undefined, and that's at half pi and negative half pi. But we can't give either of those answers because the restricted domain for arctangent is greater than negative half pi, less than positive half pi, so our answer is no solution. Here it says arcsine of sine of 7/4. Again, you would think that the arcsine and the sine just cancel each other off, but anytime you do arcsine, your answer has to be between negative half pi and positive half pi. So if we were to work this problem out, we'd have arcsine of, well, the sine of 7/4 pi is negative root 2 over 2. And if you do arcsine of negative root 2 over 2, your answer would be negative 1/4 pi. Or you could answer in degrees, negative 45 degrees. Now sometimes you're given a value like this one that's not on the unit circle. So this says cosine of tangent inverse of negative 3/4. So I'm going to draw a reference triangle. And since tangent inverse is restricted to the first and fourth quadrants, I'm going to draw a reference triangle in the fourth quadrant because my value is a negative 3/4. I'm going to put a negative 3 on the opposite of 4 on the adjacent. This would allow me to find the hypotenuse using the Pythagorean theorem, which would be 5. And now that we have that reference triangle, we find the cosine, which is 4/5. Next we have the cosine inverse of sine of pi over 3. Well, the sine of pi over 3 is square root of 3 over 2. And then the cosine inverse of square root of 3 over 2 is pi over 6, or 30 degrees. Next we have the sine of the arctangent of 5/12. So 5/12 is not on the unit circle, therefore I'm going to draw a reference triangle. Arctangent means we'd have to be in the first or fourth quadrant. Since our value is positive, I'm going to draw it in the first quadrant. I'm going to put a 5 on the opposite, a 12 on the adjacent. And that would leave me with a 13 on the hypotenuse. Now we have to find the sine of that, which would be 5/13. Next one, number 1, we've got the cosine of a cosine inverse of 1/2. In this problem, the cosine just cancels the cosine inverse, and we just get 1/2 for an answer. Number 2, we got a sine inverse of a cosine of pi over 4. Well, the cosine of pi over 4 is equal to root 2 over 2, and the sine inverse of root 2 over 2 is pi over 4. Number 3, the cosine of the tangent inverse of negative root 3 over 3. Well, the tangent inverse of negative root 3 over 3 is negative 30 degrees, and then the cosine of negative 30 degrees is root 3 over 2. Number 4, we've got tangent of sine inverse of negative root 3 over 2. And so that would give us negative 60 degrees. And then the tangent at negative 60 degrees is equal to negative root 3. Some additional inverse problems. Number 1, you can see that the sine and the sine inverse would just cancel each other off right here, giving us negative 3/4. Number 2, the cosine inverse and the cosine just cancel each other off, give us an answer of half pi. On number 3, tangent inverse of tangent doesn't cancel each other off here because we cannot give 3 pi over 2 an answer from a tangent inverse. So we'd start off by saying tangent inverse of undefined, because that's what the tangent of 3 pi over 2 is. And then the tangent inverse of undefined is either pi over 2 or negative pi over 2, but we can't give that answer. Therefore, we say no solution. Number 4, we've got sine inverse of the cosine of pi over 6, which is square root of 3 over 2. And then the sine inverse of square root of 3 over 2 would be pi over 3, or 60 degrees. Number 5, we've got the cosine of the arcsine of 1/2. Well, the arcsine of 1/2 would be 30 degrees. Cosine of 30 degrees is square root of 3 over 2. Number 6, we've got the tangent of arcsine of negative 1/2. Well, the arcsine of negative 1/2 would be negative 30 degrees. And then the tangent at negative 30 degrees is negative root 3 over 3. Number 7, the cosine and the arc cosine do not cancel because you cannot do the arc cosine of 2 because it's bigger than 1. So therefore we have a no solution. And then number 8, we've got the cosine of the arctangent of negative root 3 over 3. So we'll have to take the cosine of negative 30 degrees. And then the cosine at negative 30 degrees is equal to square root of 3 over 2.